So before we discuss the distributed nature of Git, I'd like to remind you of the centralized structure you're likely using now. If you're already using Subversion, CVS, TFS, or any other mainstream versioning system, you're used to this model already. With it, each developer works on his or her own computer and makes commits to a central server that is managing all of the code. Notice in this illustration that each developer receives updates directly from the server and sends updates directly to the server. This is a simplification of the process, but it illustrates how most developers work with source control today. So now we're going to take a look at the distributed version control model. The first thing you need to know about a distributed version control system is how the distribution works. In this scenario, everyone has their own personal source control repository. In this illustration, that repository is represented by the folder that's displayed next to the laptop. Your personal source control repository means that your commits are local. Each time you commit, you're storing a new version of the code in your local repository. This makes it easy to commit frequently, since you're worrying less about the impact on other developers. You can instead focus on making sure that you commit as often as possible. Once you've gotten your code to the point where it's ready for others to consume, you can push those changes out for other people to access. This is sort of like the committing that you did in the centralized version control system, in that this is the point where you take the code that's on your machine and send it up for others to be able to consume. Now that you have the basic concept of how distributed version control works, I'd like to show you the interactions of that distribution. The first thing you'll notice is that there are a lot more options than we had before. In fact, any of the repositories shown in this diagram can push or pull from any other repository. Don't worry though, you don't have to change your process. Most teams and most workflows still focus primarily on the traditional structure. You'll notice it's still here. At this point, I'm sure you're wondering how this more complex model can make your life easier. Let's use an example. We'll look at two developers, Brendan and Steve. These two are working together on a feature, and Steve's code is depending on some of the code that Brendan is working on. Since Brendan's not done with his feature, he has only been committing locally. Steve, however, would like to put some effort into his code and see how well it's going to integrate with Brendan's code. So Steve pulls the code from Brendan's repository instead of the central one. When Brendan finishes his code, he pushes it to the central repository. Then, Steve is able to pull the final version of Brendan's code from the central repository. Since he was already using the code, he is able to finish his task, commit locally, and then he can push his changes back to the central repository. When Steve does the merge, he will not have complex merging to deal with, like he would have done if he'd done this with a centralized versioning system that wasn't keeping track very closely of change sets. The reason for this is that Steve had Brendan's changes already when he was writing his code, so the server knows that the code that Steve was working with is the same code that Brendan pushed, and not just code affecting the same files. The unique idea of Brendan's change set allowed all this to happen.